certainly in India in a very obvious way, and perhaps in ways that scare many of us. Why is this need felt? And having said that, let me also quickly add a final sort of a footnote, or maybe a couple of them. One is this, that with, with the kind of long sort of history that we have of a civilizational kind of depth that this country possesses. One of the things that's very obvious is that we are obviously, we are clearly very forgetful people. I mean, we have I know this so-called forgetfulness has also been sort of justified, glorified, etc., precisely in some of those neo-Kantian type of frameworks. But amnesia, somehow has been a part of perhaps of our civilization process itself. Look at Buddhism. It simply vanishes. I mean, somebody may say, okay, vital elements of it were absorbed into the larger so-called Hindu sort of current of thought. I do not know. But there are many things. Ashoka, we had completely forgotten. So we are very forgetful people, even otherwise. I mean, this is way before modern colonialism. And then also of course, the very major question of what is the civilizational self we are talking about. Already in that IPQ issue, Indian Philosophy Quarterly issue, this Dharmendra Goyal talking about KCB's conservatism. And then more recently, you have Akash Singh Rathod in his book on Indian political theory saying that, okay, Goyal was right, but his target was not correct. It is rather people like Ramchandra Gandhi who in fact advocated thicker notion of Swaraj, say grounded on some kind of Advaita type of philosophy. They are the appropriate targets of this. And then he says that what we need is actually this Ambedkar type of thin Swaraj seen as true self-governance with full participation, empowerment of the subaltern element, etc. So what is the, and then Professor Kaviraj in his very long and sort of complex argument about the sudden death of Sanskrit knowledge, again talks about alternative modernities in the sort of late medieval or early modern era. I don't know how to characterize it. So this history of ours, the civilizational trajectory itself is so complex and it has so many strands, and there have been so many ruptures within it, that at this particular juncture, I mean, how does one go back to all of these things, and which of them one should fasten on, and how to, or on what ground to stand when we talk of this sort of Swaraj? Again, I do not know. And last, finally, the last point, I've come across at least a couple of articles actually written not too long, but still about more than a decade ago, I think, by a scientist who, of course, whose writings are not confined to science in the narrow sense, Rajesh Kasturirangan, who I believe, I don't know if he's still there at NIAS. This debate is actually apparently hosted by NIAS. So he, very quickly, what he's arguing is that when it comes to science and more generally culture, he says that the Bhadralok, say about in KCB's time actually, or even before that, see the creme de la creme within that Bhadralok, say Tagore or Jagdish Chandra Bose, people like that, had this sort. I mean, this question, one could hardly accuse them of not having that sort of autonomy. They had it. They had the cultural capital. They had the creativity, and they had the wherewithal. And they had the confidence. And he actually says from Raja Ramon Roy to Amartya Sen, you can see this long line of Bhadralok intellectuals who know their West, who they know Sanskrit, they don't know enough about intellectual traditions, and they're very confident, cosmopolitan, rooted, but cosmopolitan intellectuals. And it is this large, numbers of this middle class people, products of the Macaulay type of system, and those who he says man now, in fact, most of our scientific establishments and so on, and who also pretty much are people who are running our, perhaps, these the educational institutions, other research establishments, etc. He says these are the people who have though now we are, of course, politically independent, have been for so long, precisely in this era, we have lost it, actually. And one can clearly say, and this is absolutely the last thing I'm saying, and we all know it. And I often say this to my students ruefully, that the Nobel Prizes that we got, if the Nobel Prize is any indicator of creativity and so on, then those were in the colonial period. And most of the Nobel Prizes that people of Indian origin have got are, they were awarded to people who had made a conscious decision to move out of this country and so on. So there is something here, that is stifling our creativity, truly speaking. And that is what we should be now addressing, rather than, sort of any kind of narrow or, any sort of obsessive preoccupation with Swaraj in that sense of rediscovering our civilizational self, etc., etc. Sorry, I think I've been sort of all over the place, but and I have taken longer than I had thought. Thank you again.
Now, Professor Kavira, sir, can
okay.
Yeah.
Should I start now?
Please, sir.
Okay. Just a second. I'll just get my. Yeah. Anshuman, since you are running the thing, how long should I take? Should I take about 15, 20 minutes? I'll take about 15 minutes.
20 minutes should be fine. So 8 o'clock.
Okay.
Yeah, 20 minutes. Yeah.
I'll try to finish it in 15 minutes in the interest of, having a better discussion. But if I go beyond that, then tell me, I'll certainly finish by 20 minutes. So what I'm going to present in some ways would be similar to Anshuman's reading and similar to Mangesh's reading, but it would also be different in some ways. I wrote out a few lines, so let me read that out. That would make it quicker. Reading is a complex act, and there are different kinds of reading. I think as intellectuals, particularly intellectual historians like me, we do, of course, prefer slow reading, which means that we focus on the making of meanings in smaller units. So descending from an inattentive reading of a large body of work of an individual to chapters, sentences, locutions, etc., which is what we should do to K C Bhattacharya's piece if we read it respectfully, because that is what it means. But while doing that, we should not give up the opposite movement of understanding as well, that is moving back into larger wholes, the larger frames of the thinker's work, for two reasons. The first is that sometimes we cannot understand, the small locutions and propositions without their wider contextual setting. And the second, which I think is relevant to me, though this is a slightly, irreverent thing to say, that the works of all writers are not even in quality across everything that they write. And I have felt reading K C Bhattacharya, though I must say that, I read K C Bhattacharya as a political theory person, not as a philosopher. I think he's a major figure, has very, very interesting ideas, and in his generation, probably more acute than Radhakrishnan or Surendranath Dasgupta, etc. His writing is not always easy to read, even in English. For instance, I found his book, The Subject as Freedom, really hard to read and understand. And I think this text is paradoxical because there's a disjunct, in my view, between the profound problem that he outlines.
Sorry.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's a disjunct between the profound problem that he raises and the somewhat unclear answers that he offers. And in some of my work, I make a distinction between, two things, but we should not be hung up about the words. A distinction between a puzzle and a problem or a question. A puzzle is a kind of vaguer and wider field of something that puzzles us or forces us to try to understand it. A question is something which is already formed in a sense in which the range of answers is restricted. And but I'm saying this because uh, I think what we should do is, after reading it closely and respectfully, we should go back and try to see what the puzzle is and how he formulates his question and whether we should reformulate the question in our time. Now, I'll read him closely now for about 10 minutes. He and the other thing that I want you to notice and think about, is in this paper at least, he thinks in ellipses. There's very, very little by way of any single concrete example. The propositions are very general and he leaves it general, which is why, in one sense, sometimes it appears very powerful. But when you think of it, you try to sort of cash it into an exact example. It's not always easy to do. So let me read him more closely. Yeah. Should I go on?
Please, please.
Please,
Go
sir.
on.
Please, sir.
You can hear me.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right. So I think he's um, making an important distinction when he makes a distinction between subjection and slavery. And I think it's also a very interesting point that subjection is easier to understand in politics. Um, Subjection is more difficult to understand in intellectual life. And subjection becomes slavery when it is not felt any longer or is seen as good. So I think that's an important point. He also makes a distinction which I don't think he actually goes through with very clearly between assimilation and rejection. It seems that he does not mind assimilation, but I shall try to show you later why I'm not very clear what he means by assimilation. But what is clear is that he does not want a wholesale rejection of one's own culture. Then, notice the elliptical language that is thinking through metaphors. Western thinking posits us like a ghost, which is a persistent metaphor, which is very powerful. And it means that we become self-ventriloquizers in a certain sense, that when we are speaking like a ghost, like someone else, or some other thought than our own is speaking through us. It's interesting to, it's powerful to hear that, but I think we should also try to understand what it exactly means during his time and during our time. But in some cases, I can understand what he means. For instance, when Indian Marxists, because I've been all my life, more concerned with Marxist thinking in India, I can give you two examples. For instance, looking for classes in Indian society is somewhat like that. Of course, Indian society is full of hierarchies and stratification, etc. But to see them as class and simply to persist, to try to see them as class is something like this, and which led to well-known difficulties. The question, was there feudalism in Indian history? I think is a question like this. I tell my students that, when you face a question of that kind, you should not try to answer that question. You should simply ask, what kind of question is this? Should I answer the question in this form? Or is there a different, better way of looking at the intellectual or epistemic problems of the Indian past without formulating the question is like this. The next phase, he uses a metaphor which I think is not correct. He says that when we reject alien ideas, scales would fall from our eyes. I do not understand what it means. I shall actually give you an example from a modern discussion. But let me make 2 points very quickly. Would we suddenly start seeing the work through Advaitic or Nayayika or Vaishnav categories? How can we do that? because these are not categories that we can use without acquiring them, right? The Vaishnav system or the Nayaka system is an extremely complex, uh, highly, it's both complex and systematic. So it is not that if I decide that I would not use Hobbes or Marx or Foucault, that those light scales would fall from my eyes. And other categories, Advaitic or Nayayika or something like that, those categories sort of spontaneously rise in my mind. I don't think that is true. I suspect, however, that he touches on something which is very interesting. He points to the fact when he says that this happens to us because of Western education, he points, he has in mind a kind of theory of cultural self-formation, a process of learning to think about our experiences, which interposes itself between our experience and our holding that experience as an object of our own thinking, which is the process of self-formation. But I don't think he makes that explicit, except for making very um, cryptic and general remarks about our Western education. He does not go into that. But I agree with what Mangesh said, for instance, if we look into the work of people like Ramu Gandhi, who did some thinking about this, we might find that they have some kind of a critical theory of self-formation from which we can benefit. I'll give you an example of something which I found startling and I found really troubling. Rajiv Kumar, who is a friend of mine, I knew him very well in Oxford. He did an interview with Amartya Sen where he accused Sen of thinking through Western categories. But the trouble is that, this reminded me of that. If we drop thinking through Western categories about our economy, what would our thinking about the economy would look like? And I've never seen a single use of a single analytical category in Kumar, which is of non-Western provenance. So the falling of the scales from our eyes, I think it's something, it's a powerful metaphor, but it's questionable. But I think what he refers to, which is very important, is that we go through an intellectual formation process through which we come to have an estranged relation with our own tradition. I think that is what he's saying, and there are some very powerful phrases. We view our world with the mental attitude of foreign scholars. Um, he again said something which reminded me of Nehru's title. If we become sensitive to we become sensitive to the startlingness of this phrase, of the discovery of the self, because it's startling because according to at least the Cartesian tradition, the self is uh, automatically known. The self is transparent. It's pratiboda vidita, and it is perceptible without mediation, etc. Anshuman, I think, touched on something which is very interesting. He did not expand on that. But I also noted the conjunction of ideas and sentiments. I think in using sentiments, he's indicating something which precedes ideas or shapes our ideas in a certain sense, and which is more elusive. Uh, but because it's more elusive, it's more difficult to grasp and subject to critical processes. Then he says something which I find very intriguing. Then look at the example that he gives. He says that older systems of ideas and sentiments still persist in religious and social life, but not in our serious intellectual work. I think he's on to something, but I have disagreement with his ascription of significance to this, because uh, the way he puts it, it seems that having these things in our religious and social life is not important. He says it does not have any vital meaning for them. I think that's a casual phrase because religion constitutes a highly significant part of somebody's self. And again, going back to what Mangesh mentioned about from Partho's work, uh, if you use the distinction between the interior and the exterior, I think there are two uses of the distinction between interior and exterior. One use of the interior-exterior distinction means that the exterior is important because it's material, it's controlling, it consists of the systems which control our lives, etc. And interior in that sense is something which is more vulnerable, which has to be protected. And you can read it that way. But on the other hand, I think this is also implicit in the way Partha uses it. There's also a second, opposite way of using the distinction between interior and exterior, where the interior is the more valuable. The interior is something which cannot be given up, right? Even under extreme conditions. So I think he uses interior and the interiority of the religious and the social in the first sense, but we could also use it in the second sense. So Amsharan again mentioned something which I think we should think about if we have a larger discussion. Western ideas are understood and imaginatively realized. Um, I could not understand very clearly what imaginatively realized means. I thought that it probably means that we get skills for elaborating those ideas and elaborating those ideas on our own in a certain sense, the way we use Western theory to understand and explain Indian society, but it still results in habits of soulless thinking. Then I would not go into the other things which have been touched on before. Uh, so we have an option between either repeating their principles or resenting them, which is also quite interesting because he is not supporting uh, an intellectual politics of mere resentment. And I think in the decolonizing theory kind of argument, I sometimes feel that there is too much of resentment and too little of alternative theorizing. Very interesting phrase, the dark thing they call power, on page 15. We should think about that closely because why it is dark, and is it dark because it's hard to think about, or is it dark because its effects are bad? And also the question of whether we do not have a dark thing called power inside our own society, particularly in the caste order. There are a couple of things very quickly. His emphasis on our understanding the inwardness of our own traditional social structure. I'm surprised that he says that these things are not done because I know of at least 3 examples where this is done. Bhudev Mukhopadhyay, uh, Shamajik Prabandha does exactly this kind of thing, but he could say that Bhudev is a kind of standalone figure. Nobody picks up, either his challenge or his example. Comparing Indian literature with the Western, very interesting remark. But I think both Bankim and Tagore did that. We have the famous essays comparing Shakuntala and Desdemona and Kalidas and Shakespeare continually in Bengali thinking at that time. So I'm surprised why he thinks that it is not done, probably not done enough. Again, a very interesting throwaway sentence about genius in art. Uh, I suspect it's a reference probably to Tagore. And what is interesting here is that, when art is produced, we do not see that as hybridity, which is a kind of inadequate and unsuccessful putting together of things which becomes a patchwork. It produces something which is integral and powerful in itself. Fleetingly touches on the question, but I think he's very clear on this, on philosophy and the historical human sciences. I think we should probably think of that. And he comes back again and again and again to the question of the language difficulty. Let me make another point very quickly and then come to the final remarks. He has a tendency to talk about a single culture in case of both East and West, involving ideals as if there are only a single set of ideals, or we can have only a single set of responses to those ideals. And what is very interesting is that I think in the very last few sentences, what he says about a new caste developing, which is more exclusive, more intolerant than the older upper castes in Indian society, is partly right. But at the same time, that raises a very interesting question. In fact, if you contest that caste because of its inclusiveness, exclusiveness, and intolerance, Um, in the comparison itself, in the very fact that he uses caste, the real caste, as a metaphor for that, shouldn't we transfer that argument to real caste in that sense? Um, he says, again, I think both Anshuman and Mangesh responded to this partly, where the education of a people is undertaken by foreign rulers. I don't think it is entirely right, because that education was not given to us compulsorily against our will by foreign rulers. And if it had been just education given to ourselves by foreign rulers, it should have disappeared after independence, which it has not. And as Mangesh said again, I think fruitfully, that in some ways we have become recolonized after independence, much more. There's also a slight um, indeterminacy between which way he wants to go when he's thinking about indigenous ideas. On the one side, some of the indigenous ideas obviously would come from high philosophical texts from the Sanskrit, but there is also a sentence, an intriguing sentence, which says indigenous ideas that pulsate in the life and mind of the masses. So it would be interesting to ask what kind of ideas. Finally, let me finish in a couple of minutes. As I said, the writing style I find a slight impediment because it is all written in ellipses. So we are constantly pushed to guess what lies behind the metaphor and have to cash out the metaphor on our own in a certain sense, thinking of examples. But as I said before, if we step back a little from the way he formulates his question to what I call a puzzle, as a field of concern, which we all share, but where the puzzles can be formulated into questions in a slightly different way. So I think we discern in this paper some very significant and extremely difficult lines of questioning. Difficult meaning difficult about what can we do. It seems that the central question that he has is about
I
cognitive
am now
estrangement,
done.
about cognitive estrangement. Uh, this happens when what we should find normal, we are led to consider as strange. So it's a strange kind of strangeness in the middle of our thinking, which is the really powerful part of Marx's concept of estrangement. Um, so I think he also understands quite clearly that in some sense it occurs through our language, which we acquired through modern education. And um, I think we should not call it Western education today because it has been generalized and all modern education is like that. And I would give you an example and leave it there. When I ask this question, what is the center of this cognitive estrangement? Let me give you an example from the discussion about religion and secularity. I get up in the morning and I see lines of young women going to do a puja. And then we recall that today is Shivaratri. Now, and I might feel that there's something wrong about this, but we must think carefully about the strange sense of wrongness. That is, what is it that I find wrong in this? Because obviously, it cannot be wrong in a historical sense because this is actually happening all around me. Is it wrong because I expect that, there is a kind of ethical and sociological norm into which it does not fit? What is the sense in which, we have this sense of maladjustment, lack of faith, and things like that? Is this what he's saying when he says that, I have a ghost sitting inside me, which tells me that what I see with my eyes in front of me, and I see that happening every day, there's something wrong in it, because it's the ghost which thinks that it's wrong. But I think it also leads to two other questions. It might lead to a perception that we seem to be living inside two languages. There's the language of experience, which is not at least which is not academic conceptual, in which I can make sense of Shivratri quite easily, and we do all the time, and the language of analysis and judgment, which comes from a different culture, and which then actually creates this difficulty. So I'll end up by noting a point which would seem, I do not know how a follower of KCB would look at it. The term that I find most expressive and accurate in capturing this cognitive problem, right, is the term estrangement, which is the term from Marx. But I'm using it because I do not think that I have a term in Bangla which can capture this very well. Because, and there are two things to be noted in my use of the term cognitive estrangement. Of course, the term is from Marx, but I'm using it to think about a problem which was not Marx's concern at all in his uncolonized world. It's central to my colonized world. But the term comes from Marx. Is it wrong to get this term from Marx? Or is this what he is suggesting when he's saying that we should have assimilation? And I'm using it because the language of Sanskrit does not have an equivalent term, because they did not face an equivalent problem in their history. So I think I would stop here. And I think we should read this carefully, respectfully, but not submissively, because I do not think it, first of all, makes every argument entirely clear, or it makes an argument which completely satisfies me, where I feel that I should agree with him. But there's no doubt that it goes into questions which are very important during his time. And I think it is a question which is still very, very important in our time. And it should open up a discussion about the nature of our social science, our relationship to the knowledge of our society. But that knowledge comes from a knowledge of another society, which is somewhere else. Thank you.
Okay.
Finished, Arun.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, please.
Vishnu Mahapatra wants to ask question here. Vishnu, you can ask question.
Don't have question, but I have some comments as a reaction.
Sure. I think that comments are more important than questions.
So thank you very much. Three very important readings. I mean, in the world of obsolescence, the fact that the Swaraj ideas are being read and reread, it says something about the sheer capacity to survive even in 2020. I think that's something very interesting to me. The second, I think there is at the heart of that reading, what I find very interesting is this, that even when he's discussing about, this is kind of my interpretation, that even when he's discussing with the ideas, he's almost alluding to the fact that discussion about ideas is not necessarily purely an epistemic thing. In the sense that, of course, the modern education somehow makes every discussion of ideas hugely epistemic, in the sense sometimes very, very remotely connected to living life. I'm just putting them very broadly, but that's the nature of modern education, not necessarily Western education. But I think to see that point that he's making, that ideas are something to do with life, living, not merely a matter of articulating and defending only, I think is a very important point. That is, to the extent that they're connected to living. The other thing which I wanted to thought that is a kind of textual.
Vishnu, if I could interrupt you,
Yes.
you know, when you say that it must be connected to living, you know, that is still very broad. In fact, do you think that connected to living means something which is more concrete, or do you think he has something to tell us which is more concrete than saying that it should have a connection to living?
I think that it's a normative point, Sweetada, that often in our own academic exercises, our connection to the living is attenuated. And that's the nature of the modern education that you find. You know, it's not necessarily, that's the point perhaps is coming. Second, which is the question connected to your question, is that when he's making a speech in the college, I don't know the history, how that speech actually transformed into this article, which gets published in 1950s. It's very important to know that bit of history of that translation or that transformation. Is it a speech? Is this a written speech which has been published? Or this is written speech has been, or a speech which has been worked out later? It's something which a history, I think, ought to, this thing. Other thing which I think there is, Sweeta Dadu alluded to, there's an Advaitic, that idea, that metaphor of scales falling is something that you discover because something exists and something falls. You know, something, it's just like, it's very much a kind of Advaitic reasoning where you think that your soul or your Brahman exists, you only didn't know about it. It's only through a particular kind of
Menon, it's not good.
Sorry? And that, I think, is something which I thought is very important. And finally, I wanted to say that, you know, the language issue, and I think is something that our fact that we, the colonial context that we do write in English and so on and so forth, I think the stuff that he alludes to, I think is an important issue for us. I think that some of the things that we may not be able to do it, but we do it, some people do it. I mean, I know that you do it, Bhattacharya do it, I do it in different ways, but I think there are other people do it as well. But I think that still remains an issue as far as the knowledge production in our society is concerned. I think I've stopped there.
Partho. Arun, yeah.
Could I say a few things? Yeah. So thank you very much for all of these presentations. And I must say that although I have known about K C Bhattacharya for a long, long time, and I have read some of his work, but this is an essay which I had never read before. So I'll just come back to this. But just to begin with a quick point on this question of the, Mangesh made this reference to all the recent Nobel Prize winners from India who were all abroad. I think there's an interesting reference here if you were to think of it in terms of K C Bhattacharya's argument, because K C Bhattacharya, at least in this article, says very, very clearly that as far as science and mathematics is concerned, he thinks those are amenable to universal discussion and application because they do not relate to values. So therefore, in a sense, those are culture neutral. And I don't know whether economics, at least in the way it is practiced by most of these Nobel Prize winners, whether that qualifies as science or whether part of values, that there could be debate over this. But I think that's an interesting difference. And so very clearly, I think KCB is arguing here that his main concern is in the domain of values and how we receive and use values that come to us from another culture, from a foreign culture. Now, if I were to make a very straightforward summary of what he's claiming, I think he's claiming in this very simple sense that to read, to take ideas which are foreign and use them to make a kind of external critique of Indian tradition is wrong. That in order to be an effective critique of it, or tradition, or traditional institutions, or traditional values, it has to be internalized in a sense, turned into an internal critique. So effectively then what he's saying is that, let's say, an idea like, he's not using these examples, but I'm just trying to apply it. If we were to think of ideas like equality or rights, for instance, which come to us from another culture, in order for those to be effective critiques, we have to turn them into ideas or concepts which are already present in our tradition. And that is how they would be effective. Otherwise, what he's saying is they will simply be confined to a few small intellectual circle or people who are familiar with the Western context, and will be completely dissociated from any application to what he's referring to as the life of the masses and so on and so forth. I think that's basically, we can read him as saying that this is his main central claim. And if that is all that he's saying, it's probably not terribly startling or new. It would be very difficult even to contest an argument like that. I mean, there would be very little argument there. The only arguments would be about what constitutes an internalization, which is a legitimate internalization or not. That would become the main source of debate. But my suspicion is that he is actually making another kind of claim. And that is a claim that is rooted, he's expressing, it seems to me, a much more deep-seated view within the tradition of Indian philosophy about how to do philosophy. And many of you probably are familiar with the book by Janardhan Ganeri on Navya in Bengal, where he's discussing Raghunath Shiromani. And he makes this an elaborate argument. His argument is that actually Raghunath is making a very radical departure from the tradition of Nyaya in Bengal. But he does this in the form simply of an interpretation of an older text, Gangesh. And what Ganeri is saying, that is in fact the approved way of how to do philosophy. You do not make radically new claims. Anything that is new, in a sense, has to be made part of a tradition talking to itself. It's really a reinterpretation of an older tradition. In other words, as if that new idea was already there, and you're simply expressing it or bringing it out. Now, this is a very different way of doing philosophy than the Western, at least the Enlightenment onwards, the post-Enlightenment way of doing philosophy. Now, and I think this is where his real concern is, because he seems to be very much tied to that older way of doing philosophy. And he is very disapproving of the way, Western ideas are being propagated and used to make arguments for change and reform and so on. Because, look at some of the terms that he uses, including foreign ideas must be assimilated. And repeatedly he uses this term reverence for the tradition. Reverence is a word he uses at least 5 or 6 times. Now, this, it seems to me, is perhaps the ground on which he wants to stand. And so if that's the case, then it raises a whole set of questions about this, what is internalization of a critique, etc., etc. In fact, very interestingly, what he calls the, what he's disapproving, he calls it hybridization, but he uses the term Varna Sankar. Now, Varna Sankar is a far more strong word. I mean, we know it. It's like an illegitimate mixing of species. That's what and he calls it, I think, most distressing, that this is what's happening. So I think we need to think about whether that is really what he wants to argue. The second thing is his whole objection to universal values, and the way he keeps arguing that values are necessarily tied to the soil, to, he uses words of that kind, culture obviously, but to various terms that he uses to say that values cannot just be exported from one place to another. Now, this reminded me once again of a very traditional idea, which is the argument against Buddhism as a universal religion. We keep referring to this all the time, that there's a whole chain of argument against the attempt by Buddhists to claim that this is a universal religion for all of humanity and can travel to all kinds of countries. And there's a whole range, and this is not a very old idea, but I think certainly several centuries old, where the argument is that this is precisely what is wrong, that this should not happen, and therefore the whole criticism of the rejection of Buddhism was based on this. I was reminded again, this is a very, I mean, I'm probably being more provocative than I should be, but at almost the same time as KCB is writing this, 1920s, we have Mangesh is here. So in Maharashtra, Savarkar is writing Hindutva in 1923. And in Hindutva, there is a whole section against Buddhism, which argues exactly, almost the exact form of the argument against Buddhism. And then the terrible thing that Buddhism did by becoming this, claiming to be this universal religion of brotherhood, because what it does, it happens with when it becomes state religion under the Mauryas and so on, and it leads to a complete breakdown of the indigenous values and cultural institutions, and it leads to the invasion of the Shakas and so on and so forth, foreign invasions. Now, I'm not suggesting that KCB's politics was similar to Savarkar's. As far as I know, he had no specific political links with any group or anything. I mean, there's nothing to suggest that. Although there were many other major Sanskritists and intellectuals in Bengal at the time who were very close to the Hindu Mahasabha in the 20s and 30s, several of them. He was not one of them. But what I was struck by this is this similarity of the argument, that this refusal to even consider the possibility that values might also be universal. He is very, very strongly opposed to this. So my sense is that there may be more to his idea of what he thinks is a genuine Swaraj in ideas, and his understanding of what would be a proper internalization of foreign ideas may well be rooted to this. I mean, the things that I've read of KC, I read his book on Kant several years ago, and now looking back, having read this article, I wasn't very clear about what his central thrust was in that book. He discusses various specific concepts and precisely does this and tries to compare them with neighboring concepts in Indian philosophy, and tries to basically to say, in fact, now looking back, I think, trying to remember what, I couldn't find the copy of that book. Unfortunately, somebody must have liberated it from my house. But I think what he was trying to do is really to say that that the only foreign ideas which would be acceptable are those that can, in a sense, be, and I think he says this somewhere, they are simply an alternate expression of something that already exists in the tradition. So, that seems to be his main point. So I think, we need to be discerning about how much to take from this particular essay.
Could I add something to that? Just quickly to what Partha said.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, there are two things very quickly. One is what you said, Partha, about the tradition, I think is absolutely right. And that understanding of tradition is, I think, at least in the Sanskrit philosophical tradition, is there right from the time of Abhinava, because Abhinava is somebody I've read a bit more carefully, and he has this very, very well-known passage where he says, the first line is, he's talking about what he's saying, which is shatteringly new, because he's saying that there are 9 rasas where the text that he's commenting on says 8 rasas. And after saying that, he says, Amnaya Siddhe Kima Purvameta, that is, it is already there. exactly what you said. It's already there in the tradition. What is new about this? And so I think it gives us a very interesting technique of handling or developing intellectual newness in the tradition. And I think it might also show us that in some ways, we probably misunderstood this a little bit because we thought that the tradition was simply resolved not to change, but which is a complete misunderstanding of what the tradition saw and how the tradition saw about newness. But finally, the last point that you made, I think, is very important because it seems that if you argue like that in philosophy, it seems to me to be quite, quite intelligible. I would not say that I would do that myself, but if somebody says that, I wouldn't find something objectionable in it. That something that I find in Kant, which has an adjacent concept in Indian philosophy, I would try to compare it with that, or that might bring in a dimension which the Indian concept did not have, and I should incorporate that. But I think it raises problems about the question of social ideals and social value. I think that is something which is, there is a kind of uneasy silence about that, about which I think we should be clear.
Tarun Menon, might come in.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, I had a slight puzzle when I was reading this text, which I think has been partially at least cleared up by the comments that Professor Bhattacharya just made. But what struck me was what seemed to be a contradiction kind of running through the entire text, which is kind of typified by a couple of pages at the end where he, at one point it seems he's bemoaning this tendency that Indians have to accept all learning as if it's sacred. He talks about how we have this tendency to accept all learning as if it's sacred, and so we accept this kind of alien learning as sacred. And you might think from the point of view of self-determination, the problem there is with the sacredness itself at the epistemic level. We're treating learning as sacred, and so in some sense coming from an external authority. And yet, just a couple of paragraphs before, the reason he gives for why Indian civilizational thought should have primacy over the Western ideas when we attempt this assimilation is precisely because these foreign concepts have no sacredness for us, right? This is the terminology he uses. He says these foreign concepts, they don't talk to our soul. They have no sacredness for us. Right? So it seems the problem for him isn't the sacredness fundamentally. That is not the issue. What is at issue is that it is a kind of facsimile of sacredness in the case of foreign concepts, because they don't have any genuine sacredness for us. This is so the problem is not with the idea that our ideas are not genuinely self-determined in the Kantian sense of self, right? The idea that our ideas are not coming from a process of reason or rationality. That doesn't seem to be the primary concern. The primary concern seems to be different. And so I mean, it struck me as the issue is when we talk about Swaraj or self-determination, what is the self here? What is the Swa in Swaraj? At least for Gandhi, I think there was this kind of contradiction that he tussled with as well, in between thinking of it as a genuinely individual self and a kind of civilizational self. And I think you see that in this essay as well, although it seems like Professor Bhattacharya is coming down on the side of it being a kind of civilizational self, not an individual self, right? So we don't want to be self-determined in the sense of an individual self determining his or her ideas, but a civilization determining its ideas for itself. Now, this strikes me as being in contradiction with the various things he says about subjection and power and so on. Now, one can have a normative worry about not being self-determined in this civilizational sense, but that is not then a normative worry about subjection or power per se, because the notion of the self being civilization itself assumes a kind of subjection. It assumes that in some sense there is this cage from which we cannot escape, that our thinking is going to be hollow. We're not going to be able to integrate our ideas unless we just think through these ideals that are natural to us. And so, yeah, it seemed like there was a contradiction between the kind of normative emphasis on power that he placed, at least in the early part of the lecture, and then the conclusion, which seemed to suggest this more civilizational understanding of the self.
I have a question to you about how you read it, because I think you read something which is very important in this. Could I ask you a question?
Yes, please, yeah.
You know, if we go back to what you said just now, what struck me is an ambiguity about the self. You brought out one, that is the civilizational self and the individual self, etc. But isn't there also something else, you know, on which these people are not entirely clear? You know, is the self something which is given, or is the self something that is constituted?
Right.
You know, and if you think of tradition, this is something that I do with students all the time teaching. I think Shona has been in my class, so she must have, she has been part of this discussion. You know, if we define tradition following, there are many people, I follow Gadamer, for instance, but the simple meaning of tradition is the thoughts through which we think. You know, so the thought through which we think creates a problem, because the thought through which I think were given to me when I was in class 10. I was introduced to social contract theory, force theory, etc., etc. Right? Now, those are the thoughts through which we think, which I think. So, in a sense, if you ask me what is my tradition, I can give you two completely different answers. You know, one is the tradition of my society in some civilizational sense. But my question is that, you know, once colonialism intervenes in your society, right, then the thoughts through which you think are not the thoughts which come, at least unmediated, from your civilization. The problem, however, I think is the problem that I tried to bring out. That in a certain sense, your world is ever present around you, right? Your world is not the Western world. Your world is the world of Calcutta or the world of Pune. And so I think the question of what is our self and whether the tradition is given or constituted, I don't think it's actually very clearly raised in this paper and in this kind of thinking, you know, the tradition which goes from through him, through Gandhi, and all this. What do you think? I wanted to, because you have thought about this, reading this paper, I wanted to get your reaction to this.
Yeah, so I actually think so. So I do think that there was a suggestion of an answer here, but one which I find a little unsatisfactory. So one thread that seemed to be running through this text, it seemed to me, was a kind of notion of the kind of primacy of the everyday, that this kind of intellectual framework that we construct through our education is in some sense always going to be an appendage. It's not, it can't ever become the core of who we are unless it integrates with a kind of pre-existing core. That there's a core that's just established through our everyday life. And that is in some sense. And so even an intervention by colonialism then, in some sense, unless it fundamentally transforms the everyday in every respect, is not going to transform the self in that sense, right? So the civilizational self persists not through a kind of intellectual tradition, but a tradition of everyday living, the kinds of interactions you have in your family, at your temple, and so on. But what worried me is so I don't know if he thinks that this is something that's unavoidable, that it's impossible for us to kind of overwrite that self using this intellectual superstructure, or whether he simply thinks it's undesirable, that we're being kind of untrue to our soul by doing so. That is something that I'm not sure about. Both of those options seem problematic to me, but yeah, that's what I kind of took from. Yeah.
Could I just say something about on this point? Because it seems to me that as far as K C Bhattacharya is concerned, who has clearly gone through the entire sort of education system, you know, the formal colonial education system through school, college, university, and so on. But there's no question that he thinks of himself as completely firmly located within the tradition of Indian philosophy and the way Indian philosophers did Indian philosophy. I mean, including all the institutional practices so he thinks of himself as firmly located inside. And I think one of the things he's suggesting is that most others who go through that same colonial education system are not able to do this. That somehow they completely cut themselves off from any of the traditions of doing intellectual work. And I think that is really one of his main sort of complaints in this particular essay.
Can I have a question for Suyutada and also Partho as well?
Yeah, please.
The question is this. I mean, sometimes in the article you get the feeling that he wants us to present a picture where ideas from the West and ideas from India are supposed to clash. And it is only by clashing of ideas, he suggests, that we really make certain ideas our own. But at the same time, there is a sense that he presents. Tradition eventually wins. Tradition eventually assimilates in its own way. He is not obviously allowing a hypothetical situation where every clash which may entirely vanquish you or entirely overrun you. He of course is saying that because he belongs to the tradition, but there is that tension that, on the one hand, you have to have clash of ideas. You have to assimilate them because there's a clash of ideas. And at the same time, and it's only by setting up that clash, you make it your own. And it's only by making your own, you take other ideas from outside. And if you don't make them your own, they hang like an appendage. They hang like a kind of imitation. They hang like a soulless thing. That's where the source of estrangement, if I can use the word. I don't know what you have to say about that, Suyutada.
I think you are right. And this is also what Partho said initially in his comments. And I think the question of values and ideals, which I did not touch on, but Partho put quite squarely, I think it's very central to that essay. But I'm actually intrigued. I haven't done serious thinking about it. If we have a discussion, which I think we should have, in writing probably, we should all think about it. When you think of it as an intellectual process, I think it goes in one direction. If you think of it as a social process, it seems to me to go in a different direction. So when you raise the question of ideals, if you take it as an intellectual process, that I'm thinking about some philosophical issue, whether sense perception is valid or not. What is the meaning of proof? What makes some, what do we do with sense? Then, of course, you take an Indian argument, which is highly developed, sophisticated, elaborated, and place it next to a Western argument and compare them. That comparison, I think, is unproblematically productive, because you might find that there is some nuance in the Indian discussion which you do not have in the Western. I'll give you an example. For instance, in many, many different contexts, we talk about ends and means, right? And I found that in the Mimamsa tradition, when they're thinking of ends and means, in means, they have it's not a nuance, they have an element in thinking about means, which I did not ordinarily find in Western philosophy. They make a distinction between karana, that is the instrument. They're dividing karana into two parts. Karana, which is the instrument, and they explicitly introduce something which is called iti kartavyata. Iti kartavyata is like a manual of doing it, right? This is how to do it ness, iti kartavyata. Why is it interesting? Because the example that I gave in a conference was, I was asked, I think we were having a conference in Boston. I was asked, so I said, look, what he's trying to say is that suppose tomorrow we have to go back to New York, and the organizer had said that we shall give you a transport. And tomorrow morning we come out and we find standing in front of our hotel, not a car, which we expected, but a helicopter, right? Transport to New York. We would not be able to use it as a means because there is a part of the means, the instrumentality of the means, which is valid, but there's an itikartavyata, a technique of using it, which we do not have. So they make a distinction between the idea of a means of that and this. So I'm giving you this example because I think, in a case like this, you can add that, and it doesn't actually create any problem. First of all, I think there are 2 points. One is that he thinks that we should submit that to a critical examination. And after the critical examination, if there's one side is better or one side has something to offer, then we can incorporate it into that. But my problem is that when you turn to social ideals, like as Partha said, equality, I think it raises a very big problem. Big problem in the sense that suppose, what do we do with something like untouchability? Is it part of a social ideal? Of course, it is part of a social ideal in a certain sense, an ideal conceived in a particular way and then translated into an institutional structure produces that. Now, but Partho's reading of it, I think, brings out something which is very valuable. Even if we say that, we bring in something from outside, which is not inside our tradition, Partho's reading is that he's telling us that, well, you can do that, but if you're not able to make it intelligible to ordinary people, in their own terms, somehow link it to a part of argumentative tree, which is already in their own mind, right? You have to link the new branches to the existing tree. Without that, they simply would not be able to act upon it because it would not be intelligible to it. So if he says that, I think, there's something which is quite important in that. I do not know what to do with it, but this is what I thought was involved in that part of the argument. Partho, did you see it that way? Is it a right
Indeed.
construction?
There's something else, because Vishnu brought up this part where he's talking about this as a clash, and it has to be a clash. It seems to me what he's referring to here is precisely the way in which ideas have to be debated. I think the basic practice of a debate is that I bring an idea, you refute my idea, I refute your idea again, and in the end, either one side wins and the other side says, sorry, I give up, or there is a something that's modified in the course of this stage. And I think that's basically what that's the metaphor he's using. It's the metaphor of a debate. I think that is precisely what it is. And in a sense, that's very much part of the tradition of how you do philosophy.
Yeah, I agree, because, I'll give you an example from something which I find interesting but also odd. The play Agama Dambara from Kashmir, which is about clash of religious sects, right? What I found very interesting, I would actually encourage all of you who think about secularism, religion, etc., to read that. There's a Clay series translation. It's a short play. It's by Jayanta Bhatta, who is one of the great Kashmir philosophers. Part of what I found very interesting is that the play is all about debates, philosophical debates. People meet through all kinds of cursory narrative constructions, and then they debate. And what I found odd, but also very striking, was that after some time, one side of the debate would become silent. He would not be able to say anything, and it would be expressed in the narrative, in the play. He would say, Tushnim Bhumim Alikhati. That is, he's silent, and he's simply scratching on the scratching with his fingers or scratching with a twig on the ground. So he has nothing to say. And so that is one construction, that you have a debate, and eventually the debate actually leads to a clear result of that kind. One side wins, the other side loses. But I think what you are saying is more interesting and I think more realistic. That what happens is very rarely that I am reduced to a point where I actually start doing, tushnim Malikati. Because as intellectuals, we have arsenals, self-defense, which doesn't allow us to accept defeat like that. But I think what is interesting is that if we have a debate and there's power in the arguments on the opposite side, I might not be reduced to that kind of state of helplessness intellectually, but it does something to alter my own understanding of my own thinking, right? I think that is which is the conversation kind of argument. I think Shunji wants to say something. Shunji?
Yes. I think we can make a better sense of KCB by noting that he was addressing undergraduate students in the late 1920s, I think in Chandanagar College, and students were all involved in the national movement. So, and he's starting his address by criticizing the existing concept of nationalism as political freedom. So he wants to give a new dimension to nationalism. And if you read the essay, he always talks of we, he talks of the soul of India in a singular sense. I mean, and that soul is philosophy. So it's a very, very singular nationalist understanding or address that he makes. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? See, what I find is trying to read KCB through analytical lenses may be a bit unfair to him because I don't think English language was so sophisticated in 1920 that one can impose Bhattacharya's positivism to interpret KCB. It's important to note that take for example the class of ideas, unthinking conservatism versus imaginary progressivism. Now, one can suppose
imaginary or imitative?
Imaginary.
Imaginary.
Imaginary progressivism. Now, if you read
about imaginative.
Huh? Imaginative.
Yeah.
Imaginary, no?
Imaginative progressivism.
But
Imagine.
He's trying to ridicule that. But the question is, these two are diametrically opposite views. Now, one can suppose you say, is he in favor of thinking conservatism?
Speak into the mic.
If he's critical of unthinking conservatism, does it mean that he is in favor of thinking conservatism? So it's not. He's simply saying conservatism is unthinking. Therefore, it is necessary to criticize conservative views, which is unthinking. As opposed to that, you have a diametrically opposite view, which is progressivism, which is actually disconnected with socially imaginary, as Chancellor would say. So, what is important for is the theory must be intellectual formations, must be connected with the world of endoxa, as Aristotle argued, social imaginary, common sense. These are important points. That's why he said the sentiments of masses. Sentiments of masses are important for the intellectuals in India to grasp and theorize. And that point cannot be better stated in 1920, I'm telling you. Because 1920 is important. The point when Gandhian movement is yet to take shape and Gandhi makes his fervent feet, the intellectuals must they connect with masses. Idea is yet to shape. And here he's trying to spin a different idea, which is, in my view, close to Rabindranath Tagore, to some extent Ambedkar. That legacy is very important. Tagore's influence on KCB must be undeniable because Tagore clearly argues that Swaraj can't be political. It has to be cultural. Therefore, in that Tagore tradition, he tried to restate the position to students. Yes, students would have read Tagore quite well and they would have been familiar with the ideas. He tried to restate that formulation on behalf of Ravi Tagore for students of his audience. Therefore, he says Swaraj cannot be political. It is political, however, it's important that we need to Swaraj ideas, Swaraj in a cultural sense. Therefore, the spirit of cultural freedom or cultural democracy or Ambedkar would say social democracy must precede political democracy. Ravi Tagore said that and so also Ambedkar and so also K C. So it's important that we must connect his ideas with great people. But so there is singularity, I agree. Singularity is because of that time there are not many people thought of singularity is a framework for uniting people. Singularity is not about ideas. He's talking of masses, remember. He's not talking of single masses. He's simply talking of social imaginary masses. That can't be single. Therefore, the diversity is inherent in that idea. And it is implicit. Let us not rule out, let us not impose singularity on the discourse. Singularity is about uniting diversities. Uniting diversity cannot be a multiple form of unity. It is a single thread of unity to combine diverse elements of social imaginary structure, what Aristotle says, endoxa. Diversity is endoxa, united by practical wisdom of Pericles. Therefore, the Pericles of Prometheus is a united framework, a singular framework. One Pericles having one idea of democracy, trying to unite endoxa of several households. So that's the important thing. Actually, if you notice carefully, he is actually drawing the attention that the theory must be connected with ordinary people. That is one way of getting rid of this enlightenment tradition of imitating things from abroad, and one way of overcoming the fallacy of enlightenment one, and second imitation. So therefore, there are certain positive things in his text. And Partha said about his universality. I have a different interpretation of that because, see, for example, when he talks about, he is not anti-universal. If you see carefully, he is not rejecting universalism at all. He is uncomfortable with universality which is hybrid. It is not in favor of synthesis, which is what he calls, what Partha said, kind of reverence for receiving wisdom. And so therefore, in that sense, he is uncomfortable. But therefore, he is uncomfortable with the dominant universal, you can call it, or dominant which is not universal. Either way, he is uncomfortable. But he is talking about universality in spirit. Spirit, that would mean actually two things. One, it means form. Universal form is important. Second, also means universal reasoning. As Asman said, common reasoning. Reasoning and form cannot be formed without values. You just can't form a universal reasoning without choosing ethical questions. It is important that he is not so explicit about but what is the inherent idea. And let us be fair to the man because just a small text trying to understand complex ideas. And I'm sure he needs to have developed many more things which are not there. And the idea of tradition, and again the idea of reverence for tradition, in my view, it plays respect rather than owning tradition. Yeah, that's exactly he's uncomfortable. He says he actually wants uncritical conservatism. Uncritical conservatism reaffirms tradition per se. Therefore, it is important for us to be slightly internally critical of tradition, but it is the internal critique. It can't come from outside, it will fall into enlightenment trap, and it should avoid that, and then it will disconnect from social imaginary masses. Therefore, it should stay connected to the social imaginary masses. Therefore, it must come from within. So the critique of tradition is inherent in his premise of discomfort, which he expresses clearly with regard to unthinking conservatism. And similarly, unimaginative progressivism, both are problematic, and therefore discomfort is very clearly laid down by the text. Therefore, I would say he would discount the universal values of Buddhism. I don't think he grasp that is inherent in the idea because he's not rejecting universalism at all. As I say, he is for
Yeah,
universal.
if I might
For,
add,
yeah.
just a factual thing there. I was reading a paper by Jonathan Ganeri for a collection that we are editing. And that paper is actually not about KCB. He is very admiring about KCB, but that paper is about Radhakrishnan and S.B. Dashgupta, who was a student of MacTaggart's at Cambridge. He taught in Cambridge for some time before he came back to India. And at the end of his life, he went to Edinburgh as a professor of Sanskrit. So Jonathan thinks that he is also a figure like this. In fact, he calls them interjacent intellectuals, as people who live between two worlds and who are actually quite fluent in both the philosophical systems. And what is interesting there is that the discussion about universalism is a very, very common discussion at that time. Radhakrishnan addresses that, and some of the conferences that they have, conferences of, I think it was called Universal Conference of Races or something like that, which were organized to have this kind of discussion between various philosophical and religious systems. That raised the problem of universal values. And so his references to universal values are probably a bit like that. Now, Achyut wants to say something.
So thank you so much for these wonderful discussions. I just wanted to make one observation that I had about reading the book, and which is simply about the centrality of philosophy in the whole discourse. So Teacher speaks as if philosophy is the soul of both East and the West, and he speaks about philosophy as if the discipline called philosophy, or the name that we give to this discipline, philosophy that we give to this discipline, is uniform both for the East and the West. There is absolutely no problematizing of philosophy itself as the name for that discipline, or because he makes a lot of distinctions between what is thought, what is idea, which is ideal, but philosophy remains common. And having come from a tradition of, I was just reading the introduction to K C Bhattacharya in the Indian philosophy in English volume. It says that he is the single most important academic philosopher. So I was just wondering, what is the context of this confusion, or rather, I'd say, ellipsis in his concept. That's all I wanted.
But Arun, I think, I think you touched on something which is very important because it is so central to Gramsci, but it is central to all discussions of this kind. And I think he touches on something which is a very important issue, but I'm not very clear about how he thinks about it. Because I also pointed out that when he talks about our culture, our civilization, our form of thinking, he's constantly referring to two things, which are, in a factual sense separate, but they can be linked in two different ways. One is the thinking of philosophers, and the other one is the thinking of common people. Because they're references to common people and the value of their thinking. Now, there are two ways in which you can see the relation between high thinking and popular thinking. One way of conceiving that relation is that high thinking is essentially a theoretical presentation of the popular thinking. So you have popular thinking, which has all these elements, but in a more earthy form or more accessible form, sometimes in a more artistic form. And in philosophy, all these things are actually taken up, elaborated, and grounded in first principles and things like that. So there's no dissonance between the logic of philosophical thinking and the logic of common sense, right? But the other question would be, I would have two objections to that view. One is that the more I look into the highly philosophical, technical philosophical discussions about Vaishnavism, quite clear that, one of the main targets of the Vaishnavas are the Advaitic philosophers. Starting from Chaitanya himself, throughout the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, quite clear that, they are producing a really serious critique of other forms of philosophical positions, but particularly Advaitic, because they themselves see the Advaitic position as elitist, clearly. Now, if that is true, then we have to disaggregate the philosophical tradition itself, because the philosophical tradition not merely has variations, but has oppositions inside. And the other question would be that, people could say that the popular common sense and the common sense of philosophy, we cannot take it for granted that they're necessarily concordant. The popular consciousness can also be discordant in the sense that, if you look at expressions of popular consciousness, let's say in the work of Bakhtin and things like that, the rise of humor is precisely to deal with that, to undermine the somberness and the seriousness of that kind of, elite philosophical position. Essentially to say that, we do not accept everything which comes from that. And if you take that position, then you cannot take the first position that, the philosophical systems are simply greater elaboration and more philosophical grounding of popular common sense. Popular common sense and philosophical thinking can go in different directions. But one, last point about reading is that I think we are right in pointing to these things in KCB's paper, but we should not conclude from that if we had a conversation with him and asked him, why do you treat the Indian tradition as singular, that he would not have an answer. He probably would have had a highly sophisticated answer, but it's simply not presented in this particular essay.
Yeah, Jagabati,
Thanks for organizing this. This was really great. I was wondering about four terms which he uses. One is subjection. The other is, and it seems like hybridization is either a form of subjection or a kind of subjection, or it is showing that kind of subjection. And opposite to that, he presents assimilation and synthesis. But in fact, when he talks about synthesis, he comes back to assimilation. And I was not very satisfied with that concept of assimilation, because I thought in that language there is some element of power dynamic which will always be there. In fact, the point that you don't have to surrender your individuality, there is no demand for surrendering your individuality, was slightly uncomfortable for me, because there would be some amount of surrendering which will happen. If we have to take another tradition seriously, if we have to look for the appeal within the other tradition. So I was wondering whether there is some other, and in fact, it seems like hybridization would be a much better term rather than completely dismissing it. Or hybridization could be a model which will be much better than the model of assimilation. So that's what I wanted to put on the table here.
One very simple response to that would be that, I first had a question to you. When you said that you are not satisfied with the concept of assimilation, is it because you think the concept is underdetermined, that we do not know exactly what it means? Or do you think that you understand what it means, but you are unhappy with that?
I think it is kind of both, because at one level it is not clear. It is not spelled out fully what it would mean, right? I mean, what that kind of, apart from the fact that it says that you should not be surrendering your individuality completely. So that's the only only thing which is been mentioned, it seems like. But on the other hand, I think if that is what it means, right? Then there is more dissatisfaction with that, because I think that engagement with any tradition on considering it as something which is equal would require some form of individuality to be surrendered. In fact, when we come out of the debate, we will not be the same individual as we were when we began the debate. So that's the sense of uncomfortableness which I have.
No, you also made a remark which I think is very interesting. Your connection between, I did not see it when I read the paper, the connection between subjection and hybridity. He uses hybridity in a totally pejorative sense. But I think what is interesting is that, if people are happy in subjection, then why should they be hybrid? In fact, they can be completely subjected. They might actually say that, well, I simply do not want anything from this civilization. So it shows the fact that you are hybrid actually also suggests that there is something which is irreducible in your being immersed in your own civilization, which you simply cannot erase, which you cannot surrender completely.
In fact,
Anshuman wanted to say something.
Yeah.
Anshuman.
Yeah, so I think the hybridity and the process of hybridization that we are talking about. Correct me if I'm wrong. This can be easy using it as an instrument towards subjection. It's not like hybridity is subjection. The process of hybridization can be an instrument or a kind of a method towards subjection. If you can enlighten us.
No, I couldn't hear the last part of what you said.
No, I'm saying the process of hybridization, can this be understood as a kind of an instrument towards subjection in this text?
I do not know if we would, I would use the word instrument, but it is certainly a consequence of subjection. But what I wanted to say to JB's point, because I think he observed something which is very subtle, very interesting, that even if I want to subject myself totally to something which comes from outside my culture, I cannot do that. So that's why all that I can do is to be hybrid.
Can I come in briefly on this point? I think
Sure.
So I think the difference that I got between hybridization and assimilation from the essay is that assimilation is, for him at least in this essay, an inherently asymmetric concept. Assimilating X to Y is not the same thing as assimilating Y to X. Whereas hybridization is symmetric. So in some sense, he talks about how one shouldn't be assimilating the Indian tradition to the Western tradition. One should be assimilating the Western tradition to the Indian tradition. So inherent in the idea of assimilation is this idea that one is not approaching the other tradition from a perspective of equality. That there is an asymmetry in how you're approaching it. It's hybridization which presupposes this assumption of equality, but he thinks that just leads to this kind of fractured mind. There's no real integration, that any real integration requires the primacy of one tradition. And so I think, I think that there isn't actually an assumption of equality in the idea of assimilation. There is the assumption of the primacy of the Indian tradition, properly speaking, in the notion of assimilation.
Yeah.
Patada, yeah.
Can I? Patada?
Carry
on, please.
No, I just had a point on this assimilation, hybridization. I mean, it seems to me that as far as K C Bhattacharya's point goes, assimilation is when a foreign idea becomes so much a part of an internal, set of values that you don't even recognize it as foreign anymore. It is no longer foreign. Whereas hybridization is where those two things stay side by side together, mixed up, and you know which is foreign and which is ours, and yet we coexist. And I think that is what he finds most distressing. And all his arguments about the present education system and what people who are educated in English are doing, I think his main complaint seems to be that we, that we take it for as acceptable that there are these two kinds of things which go side by side, and perhaps we move from one context and another set of values tradition in another context, and he finds this, as he says, most distressing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to, yeah. I wanted to thank everybody for this incredibly rich discussion, but that's quite obvious. But I just wanted to make a limited point about what I thought were kind of three kinds of notions of self that were coming into play here. One, I think, which Parthada is kind of very clearly elaborated, is the notion of the hybrid, where the self is caught, as he says, between the external and the internal, and there is no, as it were, dialogue between themselves, between these different selves. So there's just confusion, as he calls it, which he sees as a purely negative state, unproductive of originality and so on and so forth. The second one is, I think, which Vishnu had raised, and Parthada had kind of elaborated as Vishnu had raised it as conflict, and Parthada had raised it as debate. I mean, what makes me think about this conflict and the debate format is this a debate between two different persons, or is it a debate within the self? Because at some point he actually talks about the fact that we have not internalized the ideas in order to produce a debate. Now, that seems to suggest a need for an internalization of what is seen as an external. And, in some ways, this is almost like more autobiographically more kind of resonant with KCB as whatever little that one knows of him, that in a way he's working with two traditions and constantly in dialogue and in conflict, and therefore in that a conflict that generates dialogue. And the third is assimilation, which seems to me to actually posit a kind of sovereign self, a sovereign singular self, which is very clearly located in a particular tradition, and which then has the kind of apparatus by which you select things, which knows exactly what to select and not select, and thereby translate a quote-unquote foreign idea into your own idea, if it matches or not. So you have the selectivity criteria and all of that very clearly in place. And there seems to be a tension, it seems to me, between these three kinds of notions of self doing philosophy and doing thinking. So that's just a limited point that I wanted to make here. Yeah.
Arun, we should probably think of wrapping it up now.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask a question to everyone. It seems to me clearly from this discussion, which was not, we were not well prepared in the sense that, we did not produce long papers and present long papers. But would it be worthwhile to continue the discussion about this essay itself, probably in a slightly more extended form, in writing notes or papers or something like that, and putting them together? And I also have a general question to all of you, including younger people who haven't spoken very much. What does it mean for education? If we take on board all these critical points, how should we from now on, continue our own intellectual practice? I think we should at least think about it, if we do not have a separate discussion.
Maybe Rizwan or Sona can answer your question. They're younger to all of us.
Yeah, we can give the last word to Shauna.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this, this fabulous discussion. I really, I've learned a lot. And I think one of the reasons that I was quiet was because there's so many ideas going around and one wants to pay attention to the way in which not only the close readings in the way in which a text is read, but also the way in which a discussion is followed. To the suggestion of continuing these conversations, of course, I would, very much want to do so, and be, excited to read papers that other people have, and share my own writings too. But to the larger question of what does it mean to have these ideas in, to bring these ideas critically into the way in which we think about education. I think come up with the national education policy, and in the ways in which the policy suggests that people should be studying in their local languages, and such a policy is proposing, such ideas, and of course, there are, complex issues around it. There's been a lot of discussion around what it means. But because this entire argument depends so much on metaphor and the way in which we can metaphorically think about what it means to assimilate different ideas into a certain tradition, or begin to resist the domination of certain traditions that have certain power equations. I think there's a lot to do in terms of negotiating the metaphor itself. Can we begin to produce metaphors in other languages in the way in which KCB produces metaphors in English? Or can we begin to say that the way in which KCB produces metaphors in English is a way in which he has assimilated the language in itself? At least that for me was an interesting question coming out of this debate. I don't think this is great final word, but these are just some loose thoughts that I'm having on this on the discussion.
Nilanjan, you would like to ask questions? Nilanjan, yeah.
Sir, thank you so much for this discussion. I have learned a lot, like whatever Fiona Rodriguez was saying. I was with her in the sense, like, I read the text twice or thrice. I have gone through some, I have noted out certain things, like, but when I have gone through this discussion, I have learned a lot in the sense, I just came to know how to understand specifically with the words which KCB has used in the space particularly. One thing I must, I just wanted to tell here that when Professor Sudipta Kaviraj asked us to understand the sense of education, in this piece also KCB has written that it is important to have this idea of vernacular language. From there only one can connect to one's own cultural ideas. In that sense, I was thinking again. A few years back, I asked to Professor Sudipta this question: what is our tradition basically? Again, that is continuously going on in my mind. Like when KCB has written this thing in 1920s. And he is giving this holistic idea of India, Indian nation, Indian culture. So now, if we see in that sense, like perhaps he was imagining this nation as a territorial nation whereby we Indians, but who are these we again? If at all, if I want to go back to my own, I want to connect to that old self, whereby he is talking about that connecting to the old to new self. So how to do that? Like that's where I'm confused a bit in the sense with this kind of modernity, with this kind of influences. How can one connect to? One can go back to that kind of old self. Perhaps that's what my idea. I think I could say this. Thank you so much.
Arun, go ahead. We can have a discussion, but let me make a point to what you said just now very quickly. You know, even in an absolutely elementary sense, if we think of the term tradition, what does the term tradition mean? As I said, I personally feel that that very narrow but extremely rigorous, but very narrow sense of tradition is that the thought through which I think, right? Not saying anything more about what kinds of thoughts, just the thoughts through which I think, the sense in which, the space that is 2 feet from me is closed. There are certain thoughts which are actually close to me like that. And those thoughts need not be thoughts which come from, if you're a Muslim coming from the Indian Islamic tradition or the Islamic tradition, right? The great Islamic tradition is distant from you because it's mediated through India, right? It need not be the Sanskrit tradition or the Vaishnava tradition. It can be what I was told in my school and college and university, right? But we can problematize that by saying that, there's a world which presses upon us all the time from all sides, which is not a Western world, which is our world. And that actually forces us to link with ideas, which come from our own culture. So I think that question, what is my tradition? And also remember one thing, that the Hindi translation of tradition or the Sanskrit translation would be parampara, right? And remember, one very important thing about parampara is like in Sanskrit, they would say that it's a shrinkhala, that it's a chain, right? And in Tocqueville, there's a very interesting sentence, which is very often used in people's writing, which is breaking the chain of memory, right? But the chain, the reason I'm using the term chain is that parampara basically means that it is something which must be handed down, from one to the other, to the other, to the other, both as individual, but also in terms of your own mind, right? Which is unbroken. It must be uninterrupted, right? And if you think of whatever our traditions are, I come from a Vaishnava family in Navadvip, right? You come from a Muslim background. Shona comes from a Christian background, but Shona works on Maulana Azad. And I think Maulana Azad is very deeply concerned with questions like this, right? And Shona, your question, Maulana Azad thinking that some liberal principles should be shown to be internal to Islam, right? Very similar to what Parthu was saying before, right? That is what he is trying to do. So I think the question of what is our tradition, sort of, merging or becoming the question, how do we think? And where do we get the implements of our thinking from? Can we do something about it? If my university says that you read only Hobbes and nothing else, can I say that I would take part of my time and read, let's say, Abhinava or the Vaishnavas or Advaita? Can we do that? I think, if we take this discussion seriously, there are all kinds of problems which arise from this, which I think we should discuss.
Nilanjan would like to say something? Very briefly, I will close this one there.
Not read very well, but I may be wrong, but I was having a little bit of a different notion of hybridization. A notion which is based on the ends and means, actually. I will give an example. Maybe the example is of a much more of an earlier context than on which K C Bhattacharya is talking about, much before his times. But what I felt that a small example of this sort of hybridization, where aspirations represent a sort of an aspiration towards a Western culture, but that has to be done through a series of Indian cultures. Like if I go, for example, to just after the Battle of Palasi, and to what we know as the Shobha Bazar Rajbari, the Shobha Bazar Zamindari. under Navakrishna Dev, and his metaphoric rise under the British with blessings of Robert Clive, and which has been much discussed about the colonial roots of Durga Puja, maybe the more pompous Durga Puja. So what he felt that here Durga Puja somehow represents an Indian culture, but the willingness of Navakrishna Dev and his Shobha Bazar family by adding more pomp to that show, more pomp to that Durga Puja, which is much beyond the bhakti which we have on Durga Puja, and the aspiration to rise to that Western culture where the British delegates will come to see that, so they see in their own eyes and compare it with the pompousness they have in the West. I think that aspiration towards the Western culture, which is used by a means of Indian culture, I think that is a notion of hybridization. I think that somehow came to my mind. And a second thing, that is a more a question. I think many points have been discussed, but one point I think that hasn't been quite discussed is that he has, KCB has said something about the various forms of rationalism. But I found that very unconvincing and very ambiguous. If Professor Kaviraj or Professor Chatterjee can clarify this, because he talks of basically I found two types of rationalism in one point and one more type in another point. One of them is rooted in reverence. Now, if there is too much of a reverence, and reverence somehow means faith, can that be a part of rationalism? Because reason calls for thinking and rethinking with comparison among various cultures or various ideas. So can we call that a part of rationalism? The second one he talks about is sort of an unregenerate understanding, which is mechanical. Now, this is also very unconvincing because reason can't be that much mechanical. And a third one, which he talks about in the next point, is a little bit of an sort of an obligatory form of rationalism. That is also a little bit found problematic, because obligation for what? And then he comes and talks of a real guru, maybe if he's a foreigner, but if he somehow, and he says something like this, that if it is somehow of a alternative form of an Indian thing, of an Indian idea. So again, he somehow comes back to that Indian root. And this is one problematic which I found in the whole paper, that he talks of critical space, he talks of criticality, but with a sort of an Indian root. But what we know is that critical culture or criticality is not just only Indian, it is both Indian and Western. So this is part I found very unconvincing, and if that can be clarified, sir. Thank you.
Interesting.
I don't think we should try to do it now, because it raises important questions.
But I think there's a very simple answer to what the way in which he is using rationalism and what he finds unacceptable in the way rationalism is used. I think it's a very clear rejection of the European Enlightenment idea of reason, which completely rejects what existed before and says that we have first principles and we can start and do philosophy, as it were, from scratch. I think this is precisely what he does not accept. And he finds this very distressing. That is the kind of rationalism which he does not accept.
Absolutely.
So, Arun, shall we finish here?
Finish here already. You spent almost 2 hours now.
More than 2 hours.
More than 2 hours, okay.
2.5 hours.
I must thank all of you for coming together here. And when do we meet next and actually discuss Aitanigam's book or something else?
I think you should probably have a discussion with the people who took part and get a sense of what people felt, whether this was useful or not useful in a modified form or whatever, what do we do with this? Because this is the very first experience of experimenting with something like this.
Yeah. So we can replan and we'll revisit. So I thank all of you for coming together. I can close the session. Everything that begins must come to an end. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.